All right, today I want to talk about Australian context of Asian migration, Asia-Pacific migration, and I'll just recap a few things that I think is important. Sometimes that just reinforces what I think you should know. So if you say to me, but you sort of said that other day, I'm saying it again to reinforce it in the context now of Australian, Asia-Pacific migration. So, and I just want to look at some different types of migration. I'll introduce them, but I'm not going to develop some of them till later. Yeah, close the door. We're talking about the traditional Asian model of the day, and I'll just remind you of certain things. That what we're seeing within that model is highly restricted immigration, and it's not generally seen as positive. This is in the context of most of the Asian countries. It was seen in some contexts for Japan and other countries as a temporary necessity and not a structural feature of the economy, like is the case in Australia. So it's like a structural, it's not a structural necessity, but something, okay, we need temporary workers at this stage, we need to fill some gaps. And most of the emphasis has been on policing it or restricting it, and compliance not with necessarily the management. Remember, Australia's migration programs highly managed and structured. Strictly temporary, no access to settlement or citizenships, and even now they've become more flexible. We still have this problem of foreigners being foreigners and not necessarily moving to being permanent citizens or residents. No openness of national cultures to change, meaning not multiculturalism, not interested in integrating many of the foreigners within the national culture. Failures to recognise how increasingly it was becoming necessary to allow migration, and generally a lack of multilateral cooperation or cooperation between countries. Increasingly, more and more memorandums of understanding, MOUs, but not really very specific trade agreements, which is now very much more the case. The trade agreements tends to be flow of finance, but also flow of migrants and flow of people as well. Major types within the region, we're talking about south-north, south-south generally, and south-south become more prominent in terms of the more high-income Asian countries attracting workers from the low-income countries, meaning they really need them, so there's been much more movement across Asian countries themselves. We just talked about labour migration. Next Thursday, you'll have a lecture from George Tan, who did his PhD on student migration, so he'll give you insight into student migration specifically. And I'll talk a bit today about overseas contract workers. We were talking about them in the tutes, but today I'll just go through some facts and figures. And we'll also pick up refugees and other forced migrants in the next week or so. Marriage migration has been a very important component, and increasingly so in many of these Asian countries, and I'll say why. And transit migration, again, we'll deal with it a bit later, but some of these areas become points of transit for migrants and refugees that move on to other countries. And last of all, people smuggling and trafficking. Again, a major component of the world migration industry, if you like to call it that. That industry facilitates migration in the region. There's things called recruiters. They recruit labour, particularly contract labour, to go elsewhere. There's middlemen that do some of the facilitating and getting visas, etc. There's agents. They can be employed by government or private agents. There's travel providers. that can organise your travel, and that often is through a migration agent. There's forgers of passports, documents, etc. Immigration officials, government involvement, etc. So there's a lot of people that make money in facilitating this migration across the region.
So what is
Forgers, like you forge your passport or a document, a false, making a false one. And it's not just passports, often documents that get you out of the country, or a visa into another country, which is not official. It's got a lot of that self-perpetuating. People are making money and they've got their connections, and the connections tend to reinforce where migrants are going and the sort of jobs they're going to as well. So it's a profitable business, a highly profitable business for some of these people, selling services, and it involves often private and government. And they say, and this is not official, that a lot of government officials get bribed in terms of corruption, bribery to get your false documents or get you into particular or out of particular countries. And it facilitates both documented and undocumented. We just call it undocumented, but it's usually illegal migration. Self-perpetuating dynamism, meaning everybody's got a role in this, and it tends to reinforce it all, and people have trade-offs in terms of that whole mechanism. So Asian migration, as we've been talking about, is an increased focus on skill. Generally throughout Asia, decreased focus on family migration. It's very much linked with student migration, coming in as students. We call them designer migrants. So come and get qualifications here, qualifications in the Australian labour market, which will give them a better chance of getting permanent residency or employment. Generally, there's been increased involvement of women. We call it feminisation. There's debates over unskilled worker needs, but clearly throughout Asia, there's a lot of movement of unskilled and low-skilled workers in demand across the region, and it's predominantly temporary migration. It's predominantly temporary migration because a lot of those governments really aren't facilitating permanent migration or the move to permanent migration, meaning it's difficult to do unless you're in a certain class of foreign workers, etc. Social networks are really important in the whole process. Most migrants will know someone at the destination. And so it's crucial in the decision to move, but it's also crucial where to move. So you get concentrations. We used to call it chain migration. We don't call it chain migration so much now. We just refer to it as social networks. It's usually crucial to get a job and to get settled, to get housing at the destination. So they provide all this information, and it's much easier or facilitates that move to a certain location. So therefore we tend to have concentrations that build up in particular places. So workers go from X to Y because people return from there, or we've got information about the labour market, or contract workers, they come back with stories, whatever, so the next wave of workers will go to those destinations. And there'll be very specific links between destination and origin within countries. Other drivers that we've talked about is obviously changes in transport and communication, cheap relative transport allows longer distances to be travelled or places to seek out. Communication now, obviously IT has changed to the point you can Skype, you can stay in contact, and most long distance phone or mobile phone now providers much cheaper than it used to be. Levels of education has increased, allowing more movement basically of different levels of workers. Globalisation of private industry. Private industry has regional offices or country offices, national offices that people move to and actually get that experience and move on to somewhere else. Increased government involvement, we were talking about in the tutorials. India, Philippines, for example, have set up ministries of emigration, not immigration, emigration. We did talk about the why for that yesterday. Why? What advantage is it for them to have a ministry of out-migration? What are they trying to achieve?
Links with more developed countries?
Yeah, or even across the Asian region, higher income countries, or thinking very selfishly of themselves. They've got an oversupply of young workers that they can't find jobs for, that many of them more highly educated than they've ever been before, and it's their experience going somewhere else that they bring back ideas, but they also send back money. So they're encouraging us, they're saying that ministry is important for also setting up, as you say, linkages or memorandums of understanding that these workers will be treated properly, and they also tend to have like training sessions for people to know what they're going to be in for, and they have much more involvement, like in trying to ensure those streams, it's not just abusive types of migration. So they see the advantage of that to the country, so they've actually managing it by setting up more controls or rules. And sex segregation of the labour market has been really important in terms of generating many more females leaving some countries than others and going to some countries. And we'll get to that later too, because there's problems with leaving children behind sometimes. So they see it as a social disadvantage of that happening, so they've been trying to manage that a little bit better as well. When we're talking about labour market segmentation, different labour markets require different workers, so therefore, and they also recruit from different regions. So for example, Burma, Laos, Cambodian, South Asians, tend to be recruited into Thailand, for agriculture, fisheries, construction, domestic service, factory work in particularly Bangkok and some of the big cities. Predominantly rural Indonesians, for example, would go to the plantations in Malaysia, rubber plantations, other sorts of palm oil plantations in Malaysia. Construction, again, domestic service, really important, and also factory work, where you'll find Thais going perhaps to Taiwan, Singapore for factory work. It's like another level up for them. In Malaysia, also you'll get other Malaysians going elsewhere, Singapore, Japan, for types of factory work or whatever. And it's generally lower skilled workers or semi-skilled in some of those latter segments. So very much different countries will be demanding different sorts of labour. Now we talked briefly yesterday, and it's in that reading, about contract labour migration. And this is very much a widespread form of migration throughout the Asia-Pacific region. And it usually involves a 2-year contract 2-year contract, you're contracted to work in another country. You don't sort of get holidays or time to go home. You go for that 2-year period. You usually travel without your family, so it's single contract workers in demand. There's usually middlemen that facilitate or recruit the workers, get your passports, your documentation to work, set up your new job, set up your accommodation, like in other words, it's arranged. It's mostly unskilled, low skilled, and generally you have to pay back this middleman, and that might mean they keep your passport or until the end of your contract to go home, or until you've actually repaid the money that might have cost them to get you to these jobs. Unfortunately, there's lack of really accurate data, but most countries now keep official figures on overseas contract labour migration, and we could say it's about half probably of what's occurring. But clearly it is occurring and it's underestimated usually. These overseas contract workers basically been increasing in numbers. They've served a purpose for a lot of countries that have been going through change, particularly the Arab states and other places have been building stadiums or huge skyscraper buildings or whatever. And there's generally increasing numbers of countries involved in negotiating to get these workers. There's a feminisation, so in that labour market segmentation, there is also a sex segregation, meaning some areas want females. They want them for domestic work, they want them for nursing, or they want them for carers, aged carers, child carers, cleaners, you name it. It's often the lower level jobs that they're being recruited for. And we did talk about the sex industry, entertainment industry, etc. as well, that these females are being enticed into, but under different names, entertainers, dancers, hostesses, whatever. There's generally increased government involvement and acceptance, meaning they're quite pleased to actually accept these overseas contract workers, and those governments sending them, particularly Philippines, also Indonesia, a bit less extent, quite happy to have these arrangements that have been occurring. Undocumented and documented, unfortunately, and there's protection issues. So those undocumented streams tend to be have no comeback if the jobs aren't what they're meant to be, or women generally get trapped in situations until their package or their visas have been paid off, or they could have abusive employers and there's no rights for them basically. So that's where the government involvement has been trying to, but memorandums of understanding, that's exactly what they are, often just understanding, but at least it's the start. And many of the countries they're going to, they don't have labour laws or occupational health and safety, for example, for contract workers. So there's those issues involved that often are specified in their documents, but there's no one there to regulate or police what is actually going on sometimes. You probably won't read that, and it doesn't really matter. I just want to point out these are stocks of migrant workers, and where we find big stocks, obviously Philippines, something like 8 million, Burma, almost 2 million, Indonesia, 2 million, India, 3 million, Bangladesh, Pakistan, 3 odd million. But Sri Lanka, much smaller country's got 1.5 million roughly, and Nepal's got about 1.5 million. And we'll say a bit something about that later. These are really countries that are relying on these contract workers going elsewhere as singles, sending money back to families, supporting families within those regions. And other countries also with immigration departments, but also setting up good links, trying to protect their workers. Just all I want you to take from this, this is just, and again, these are just documented flows. This is Philippines overseas employment, let's say 1.5 million, 2010, 54% of them were women. So predominantly women. Same with Sri Lanka, predominantly women. Thailand, many more men. Indonesia, 2/3 women. Vietnam, much lower proportion of women, and so is Bangladesh. So there's differences within those contract workers. Again, it matches countries where they're going, where there's a demand. That's just, again, just figures that, yeah, they estimated stocks, and that's from official, usually government sources. Okay, marriage migration. That's becoming increasingly important and increasingly intermarriage between countries. So that's producing a change in attitudes to migration in countries such as Japan or South Korea or Taiwan. Formerly opposed to it. If you're going to have marriage migration, you're going to have to accept these people as citizens, or you're going to have to give them permanent residence if they're getting married to, obviously, nationals within those countries. There's 3 types. The first one is spontaneous, as a result of increased international travel amongst young adults, like my exchange students coming here, suddenly meeting you two, me, I'm and you, well, I don't know, whoever, you meet someone or a local Australian or whatever. So there's many more chances for you to mix and actually meet another partner somewhere else. And then that will set up how do we marry, where do we live, and what citizenship we're going to actually have to take. Diaspora-related matches, particularly with Indian, Bangladeshis and a lot of other groups, they have, from the groups outside Australia, arranged marriages amongst Indians back home. Arranged marriage is not as strong as it used to be, but nevertheless they often choose partners from their home countries. And again, it's up to the government to be able to change policy or allow them in to become permanent citizens. And yes, there have been a thing called male brides, and so some of the laws have been clamped down a bit about that. You've got to really prove they are a fiancé and you're not just coming to marry. Or commodified, arranged through marriage brokers. So a marriage broker, actually, again, just like your labour broker, will try to get prospective spouses from a particular country where the request comes from. That commodified Asian marriage, again, key role of agents and matchmakers, especially important in countries where sons have been preferred and have resulted in unbalanced sex ratios currently, but in the future it's meant to be a real drought. By 2020, excess of 20 million males in China. It's called the Bear Branches. Okay, so those males are going to move somewhere else to find a bride. What's usually happening is brides are being recruited from elsewhere, and that's particularly the case in Japan. In other countries you'll find Vietnamese, Filipinos, Burmese creeping into that market as well. So recruiters go out and try to find these brides to match with. These are often rural males, etc., that don't have much chance of finding a bride. And this is where sex imbalances also exist in India, where you've got this preference for sons, and for a long time people were trying to, son preference meant sometimes the female babies didn't get good health, or they were aborted, or they were through testing, etc. Main destination is South Korea, Taiwan, Japan or Singapore. And the main origin countries, Vietnam, Cambodia, Philippines, Thailand and Indonesia. Okay, there's big issues about discrimination and what some of the contexts those females are moving into. This is where the role of non-government organisations has been important as well in terms of trying to educate people to cultures involved and what's actually happening. That commodified Asian marriage is quite interesting because I was at the East West Centre in 1985 on a population seminar. I was an ageing seminar for 4 weeks. There was a little Japanese girl there, and I always remember this because I thought how strange at the time. If you go and date somebody, go out for a date, the first question she said you always ask, are you a first son? Like, are you son number one? Firstborn son. Why do you think she said you must ask that question? Some of you must.
Because they'd be the ones like taking over the family and farms.
Yeah, you have to have your mother-in-law, for example, live with you if you know, in old age, and you actually get left as the carer or the principal carer. Second sons, or after a fine, they're really allowed to do their own thing. But the first son has this duty to family, and because it's patriarchal society, that you'll end up, as she said, because or otherwise, you look at this first son, but you also go to meet your mother-in-law at that stage, she said, because otherwise your life will be hell. And I thought, I've always remembered that and thought, oh, okay. And that's, again, women changing roles, changing education, not wanting those let's say, burdens. And therefore, what are Japanese men doing? Trying to export or import brides, not with those values, basically. Transit migration is another form of migration, involves migrants intending to migrate to a particular destination, having a temporary stay in another country until they get a visa or until they can get through to where they want to go. Tends to involve both refugees but also other migrants sometimes, like stepping stone migration. New Zealand, for example, Pacific Islanders often go there almost as a transit country to get citizenship, which allows them to come to Australia, or even can give them a better stepping stone into Australia. But refugees might go to other countries. Those on the fringe of European community, maybe Turkey, Russia, may not be Libya at the moment probably. And so there's this intermediary where you'll find in context of Asian migration, which we'll talk about later, is through Indonesia. You'll get some countries, some groups coming through. So Pakistan and Iran, transit points for migrant from Afghanistan or Iraq. So they get into those countries, then they have to negotiate somehow or other to get where they want to actually go. Malaysia and Indonesia really are very good transit points for people from Afghanistan, Iraq, Sri Lanka and China. And Thailand tends to be transit points for Indochina, Myanmar, Burma and South Asia. So if they can get into those countries relatively quickly through airports, usually get into Malaysia just on a visitor visa, and then get transit into Indonesia, and guess where they're trying to wait to come to is usually Australia. And they wait till there's an opportunity, legally or illegal usually, in terms of getting arrangement or visa to come into Australia. And that's what the Australian government in particular has been cutting off some of that source in terms of migrants or refugees. Undocumented migration generally takes many sort of forms, and there's different types, and we don't have a firm handle on how many. Okay, not surprisingly, it's not going through official channels, so we usually only estimate. But you know, our middlemen, our migration industry trading people, they deal in both markets, the legal one and the illegal one. They know all the routes, they know all the tricks, if you like, so they are the people that are trading in both. Most extreme form is trafficking. So where you see trafficking, people are generally moved against their will. Okay, they traffic. They still might be paying for that movement, but they're not generally getting exactly, well, they haven't got much free choice. This is where intermediaries are important. These are where your forgers or your agents, and people are having to forge documents to get them past authorities in particular countries. Different to people smuggling, where people are moving without documents but are voluntarily moving. They're actually paying the smugglers, and they need usually, or let's say they know their destinations, they know where they're being smuggled to, but they generally don't know the conditions that they're going to be smuggled in. We basically don't have much information about some of the documented channels, or the undocumented matching with the documented channels, but we know that they're going on together generally. So these are estimates again. Bangladesh to India, supposedly 20 million. I have got question marks on these. Indonesia to Malaysia. Malaysian Straits, Malacca Straits are very close to Indonesia. They say more than 2.5 million are going across there just illegally. Myanmar to Thailand, crossing the border, 2 million, and there's many other smaller flows. So these are undocumented flows. We know they're happening. If you go and interview in some of those places, you'll find as many undocumented workers in Malaysia as there is documented, and many of them are Indonesians, some documented, some undocumented. This is just a model of the Asia-Australian system, if you like. This is an Asian country. This is permanent settlement of Asians in Australia. It's quite a thick arrow. This one down here is return migration from Australia to Asia, which is a smaller one, and this one is also reciprocal migration of Australians to Asia, which is very much smaller, very lean line indeed. Right? We have more and more circular migration going on here as temporary movement, short-term movement. And once we get into Australia, we also have third country migration. And into Australia, you also have indirect migration, like Pacific Islanders going to New Zealand and then coming into Australia, or Asian groups going into New Zealand or somewhere getting citizenship and coming into Australia. Or South Africans going to New Zealand and coming into Australia. So that indirect is also something we can actually judge it in terms of different citizenships and birthplaces coming in under those figures, which I'll show you later. So this Australian-Asia migration system, it's generally permanent settlement of Asians in Australia. That's opened up with skilled migration, many Asian nations becoming students or coming into Australia as independent employer nominated. And I'll talk about the short-term and long-term movement as well as permanent. How do we justify, or how do we judge short-term, long-term movement? There's definitions I want you to know in a minute. Indirect settlement migration to Australia via another country, meaning via Indonesia or via New Zealand or somewhere. Return migration is important. There is some reciprocal migration between Australia and Asia, but it's generally quite small. And the circulation going around temporary visas for skilled workers generally. This is my category of movement that you must learn this one, must know this one, because when they're coming up in the figures a bit later, you'll understand. This is for Australia definition. Overseas arrivals and departures are classified according to length of stay, so how long you're staying in Australia or overseas. Recorded in months and days by travellers on your passenger cards. Remember your passenger card asks how long you're staying? And so this is the information, or the other benchmarks used. Permanent movement. Long-term movement means 1 year or more. So on your card you've said, I'm coming for a year, or over a year, or 2 years, or whatever, or 3 years to do a course, or whatever you've said on that card. Short-term movements are less than 1 year. So that's all your visitors, business, or people coming for short holidays, or to visit family and friends, etc. So those categories are important. You might well say to me, okay, they're different than some of the temporary work categories up 2 to 4 years. Yes, they are. They cut across them, but that's how we identify our overseas arrivals. So short-term movers, Australian residents and citizens who intend to stay abroad is less than 12 months. Okay, so we're leaving the country and we're saying, I don't know, it's 6 months and 11 days or whatever. And foreign visitors who intend to stay in Australia is less than 12 months. They're all seen as short-term movers, those leaving and those coming. Long-term movers are Australian residents and citizens who intend to return, but with the intended length of stay abroad being 12 months or more. So that 1 year period is important. And foreign visitors with temporary residence who intend to leave Australia, but after a period of more than 12 months. Okay, permanent movements, obviously including former settlers, departing with the stated intention of staying or residing overseas permanently. Foreigners arriving with the stated intention of remaining permanently in Australia. And we know those intentions can change, but broadly that's the definition based on those arrival departure cards, and they're called flow data, aren't they? Flow data, looking at toing and froing, and that is the reported definitions. So according to those definitions, I'm going to show you what some of the patterns look like. So this is settler arrivals. So these are my permanent settler arrivals coming into Australia. The black is Asia. Pacific is the grey. And the open bar is just other. So from 93-94 up to 2011-12, we can see increase of Asian permanent settlers. Pacific sort of maintained its own there, and generally the Asian permanent arrivals have actually put up overall permanent arrivals. These are long term. What are long term? A year, more than a year. By birthplace, again Asia, okay, increase and quite significant portion, not so much for Pacific, other overseas. A lot of these can be students, or they can be other people, business, etc., coming into the country for that period of they've intended to stay a year or more. Okay, Australian Asian migration generally can be return migration. This is back to Asia. Australian-born children of migrants to Asia. Increasing temporary flow of Australian-born to Asia, and that's generally temporary, not permanent. and temporary flow of Asian settlers back to Asia. So they change later and move back. These are permanent departures of Australia. So they've classified themselves of leaving Australia permanently, if you like. The black now is Australian born. So they're Australian born. Some of that Australian born could be children of Asian born or other born groups. The next one here is Asian born, which has been increasing. Pacific born is relatively low, and the others. Those are going from Australia back to Asia and Pacific. Long-term departures to Asia. Again, the long-term departures, very different picture. Got Australian born trundling along the bottom, and other overseas born making up the bulk of those. In other words, they've come here for a year or so and they're actually going back. These are short-term visitors. What's short-term visitor? Less than 12 months. Visits to Australia by Asian born. Why are they coming here? You say 68% or 2/3 are holidays or visiting relatives and friends. 10% education, so 78%. So again, students studying in Adelaide, or Australia generally, a lot of visits from overseas people or friends or relatives or whatever coming in to the country, so much more toing and froing in that sort of context. Short-term departures to Asia of Australia and overseas born. Again, this is my grey, is my overseas Australian born. It's increased. That's your holidays to Bali or to Indonesia or elsewhere. So in Asia, so it's just to Asia, and that's been increasing quite dramatically. So that short-term movement is important. And the other thing we should, do you want to be confused now? I guess you better be confused. That is not individuals moving, it's movement. So it could be the same individual moving a couple of times in a year. So in other words, it's all the departures and all the arrivals. So it could be quite frequent visits overseas, businessmen or people, travellers into Asia, and they're all counted in those figures. Short-term visits to Asia, again, as we suspect, holidays 75%, visiting friends, relatives 9%, education's only less than 1%. So clearly, travel, visiting, holidays, visiting relatives is very important for this new form of movement between the countries. So these importance of transnational connections generate other sort of movements and, let's say, business and trade movements as well. There's obviously a lot of connection with areas of origin, and also information technology changes, etc. Cheap travel is actually promoting much more of this movement that is increasing. Generally, constraints in studying some of this Asia Pacific, we've talked about data limitations, complexity of the region. Complexity of the region means different countries within the region, different labour market demands, and therefore different migration flows. The diversity of countries instead of in respect to high income, low income, middle income, levels of development very different, policies very different, involvement of the governments also very different. There's still a bias in most of those destination countries in data, meaning they collected on foreigners coming in but not people leaving, so they don't have that out movement like we do, for example. And there's also a fixation with permanent settlement usually rather than that short term, and that particularly that long-term movement. That long-term movement intentions perhaps is the most difficult, because you say you're coming for a year, but maybe the long, you stay here and it's what you want, so it's much longer, or you get your visas or whatever. Long distance, therefore, often becomes permanent or more settler migration, and sometimes it doesn't last the year. In other words, you're not so wrapped with this place and it hasn't turned out, so you're really a short-term mover. So those categorisations are important, but the other problem also is it's counting all movement rather than people. So that short-term and long-term probably exaggerates the movement because it's not by person. Migration discussion amongst Asia-Pacific policymakers that should be made. That change is apparent in the data, but it differs between countries, and there is much that remains of the old approaches to migration. As we said, those original restrictive policies, mentality is often there in terms of when it comes to permanent residence. Migration must be managed and needs good governance systems in place, and I'm particularly there talking about overseas contract workers, which is a bit of a supply-demand problem going on at the moment. Migration remains a sensitive and controversial issue in the region and basically requires cooperation. So in conclusion, migration needs to be unravelled by type. It's on complex, dynamic and by no means homogeneous. By type, what do I mean? I mean labour migration or marriage migration or contract work migration. They'll have very different outcomes for the countries, but particularly for the migrants themselves. Labour migration is dominating the flows within the Asian region itself, and that's where your linkages with contract labour demands and job segregation, and all that raises really severe issues, some of which we'll explore a bit later, particularly in countries where females' labour is required. From Sri Lanka, for example, the males are left holding the babies, if you like, or left home with children, often least experienced to manage families, and grandparents, aunts, uncles often have to get involved in the caring. And when we come to that, I'll say that we had a PhD student a few years ago exploring a policy currently being put in by the government, well, they were anticipating it, of banning any mothers migrating if their children are under school age. In other words, that was going to really upset the family household incomes and structure that was going on. It didn't happen, actually, by the way. And Australia and Asia migration increasingly linked and reciprocal, largely focused on students toing and froing and skilled workers due to policy changes by the Australian government in particular for temporary migration visas, and it became necessary to compete in that globalised market. And I'll talk more specifically about some of those things. Okay? So it's complex. We can't generalise, which should be some of the when sometimes you look at the literature or policy, it assumes that everywhere is the same, but we can't. Okay.